Hi, good day, everyone, and welcome to our Midweek podcast. I get the opportunity to switch roles today. So Nick was our guest preacher, and so I get an opportunity to use this to unpack the sermon a little bit more, go a bit deeper. And so that's what we do in this Midweek podcast. So Nick, firstly, thank you for another excellent sermon.
Oh, thanks. It's a pleasure to do it.
I know, and certainly from me, and I've got lots of great appreciative feedback from people, and I hope that you've received that too. So Nick, just starting off, and you began your sermon talking about the dangers of a toxic culture, and you shared one example, but I was wondering if you had another one to share with us about a culture that really devours people, any experience that you have had, and I've got one that I can share as well, but I'll give you the opportunity to go first.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's really easy to find examples.
That's not good.
That's not a good thing. But I remember this one time I was the youth pastor at a church, and the youth group had a culture of sarcasm and teasing. Yeah. And you know, that's okay. That can be fine. But in this case, it was going too far. Yeah. And so we kind of had to try and change gears. Because, you know, once something gets spoiled, once it goes too far, you got to rein it back in.
And words cut deep as well, especially the teasing and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's one of those ones that maybe is a bit gray. Like sometimes it's okay to tease, and sometimes it goes too far.
Yeah, no, that is true. That is true. And I was thinking of myself as well. And my example also comes from the world of work. Quite a lot of my examples probably do. And one of the companies that I worked for, and I worked there for a short period of time, had also a very toxic culture. It was a large national company and actually been bought over by a multinational organization. So they had a lot of those kind of dynamics. But even historically, the company, many of its leaders came from an ex-military background in South Africa and would have been part of the then apartheid regime. So there was that dynamic to it as well. And they took that same mindset into the company, and that mindset of definitely machismo, but also viewing any opposition as an enemy. And everything, you constantly felt that everything was this tactical move, you know. So not only was the competition the enemy, but anybody internally who was a threat to a particular leader's vision of what they wanted to do in the area, you know, you had to develop this tactic to get around that person, to outmaneuver them. And it wasn't just one person, it was really across the organization. So I sort of stepped into this, and this was weird. Mm-hmm. And I came from a previous company where that just was not the culture. The company had intentionally tried to create a family type of culture.
Right.
And so I walked into this, and Shannon says she always remembers, after about a week or two, I said, I'm not going to be here long. It took me about 2 years to make the move, and I learned a lot in that experience, but that was just one of those weird cultures where you realize this is not healthy, and it devoured people, and you could see some of the consequences on people's mental and emotional health. Yeah. You know, being in that kind of a culture, and sometimes you can change it, other times you can't, and you just choose to remove yourself from it.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So talking about changing cultures, you know, we don't want to give people the impression that certain things are fixed and can't be different. And as people of faith who carry the kingdom with us, we want to be salt and light, and we want to leaven things where we are. So do you have an example, a positive one of either a great culture or being in a place where people intentionally shifted the culture to one that placed value on people?
Yeah, so that's coming off the coattails of that example I gave already, this youth group that had a toxic teasing culture and a toxic competitive culture. One of the things that I purposefully tried to do is to shift us towards collaborative exercises, activities, games, where the group was put in a place where they actually had to work together to really try and win the game or the task or the challenge that I gave them. And that really helped. That really turned it into a place where you didn't try to beat down and then talk smack to someone that you beat them. And it also meant that anytime that they lost or failed, it was always a team effort.
It was a team thing. Yeah.
It was a team effort to take this.
You owned it collectively, but there is something in that. There is something in that, and great that you're able to do that and show them the value of collaboration and teamwork.
Yeah, it took structural change, right? Not every culture can do that, but I really do think that a lot of our toxic cultures can be shifted when we start talking about the structure that we have in place.
Yeah.
So,
and it's interesting you should mention it about the structures, but also talking about the kind of values that you want to instill in people and how we go about them. So not just talking about it, but intentionally. I liked your example about using practical exercises, to build that in them. And certainly I'm thinking of an example that from my own background, and again, it's from my world of work, and it's one of those few opportunities where you're able to look back on something and go like, wow, that actually made a difference.
Yeah.
So one of the other companies I worked for was a global multinational, great company. And like so many multinationals nowadays, it had employees from all over the world. And it also had a manufacturing plant. So it had employees from what we regard today as, developing countries.
Right.
And many of them were housed in pretty deplorable conditions. And this company actually had one of these facilities that we'd probably today call a dormitory residence, that they shared with many other companies. And this was a male facility. So these were men who had come from other countries. They were working there. They'd often be there for long periods of time, far away from home, in close confines. And we had a number of units. And so I found this out. And the company was talking about its values and all that. And we started to speak about, well, this just doesn't really fit with our values, and this is not the way we want to treat people. So actually, together with a group, we went to go do an inspection. And oh my goodness, it was pretty deplorable. It was pretty deplorable. It was close to slum-like conditions. And so there were these 6 to 8 men in the small, sharing a single room and a small kitchen. And it was really, really terrible. And it took a number of my colleagues from various parts of the business with me, and I could see it really hit them. Yeah. It really hit people like, wow, we've been blind to this, but now we see it and we can't pretend we, haven't seen it. And so put together a small team, a project team to tackle one of the suites, and then over time to tackle the others. And within about a 6 to 8 week period, they are on their own time, actually got together and totally revamped it. I wish I could have done one of those makeover things.
Yeah.
So these guys, from having probably one of the worst suites in the dormitory, now suddenly had one of the best suites.
Very posh, right?
Very, very posh, and everything new and redone, etc., etc. But it was one of those interesting exercises. I mean, it was a wonderful way of just showing value to these employees who were often at the bottom. But the change actually that I saw in my colleagues who did it, it was huge. They were so excited to start tackling the next one, and they were the ones motivating thereafter for the funds to be able to make this happen. So you can change.
Yeah.
You can change cultures, and I think as believers, we have to continue to hold on to that hope that we can make a difference, even if it's small, wherever we are.
Yeah.
So segueing into one of my favorite Psalms that you picked up on.
Yeah.
Psalm 73, my feet almost slipped when I looked at the wicked and how they prosper. So Psalm 73 is a great Psalm. And if you've never read it, certainly read it. It's one of those Psalms that just speaks with raw honesty, about about injustice and the seeming indifference towards injustice. So Psalm 73 depicts the author as struggling with injustice, the rampant injustice in society, but then finally entering into the sanctuary, the place where we meet God, and the perspective on life and on justice and all that changes. Great picture. And for us now as Christians, what do you think should be our practice? How can we adopt a similar kind of posture? And what does it look like for us today?
Yeah, I think that question of where do we look?
Yeah.
I think in our culture, we look in our own imagination, which is why we have so many great movies and interesting novels and things like that. And they kind of depict this utopia. But obviously, middle of the century here, we kind of made a shift from utopia to dystopia.
Yeah.
And it really highlights the dangers of this idea of chasing after an ideal. I think for us as Christians, though, and especially Anabaptists, we look to the early church. When we're talking about looking towards where do we look for the example of justice, of right living, of being connected, we look to the early church. And what we see is a messy place. It's not perfect. It's not a utopia. But it's a real time period where people approached community and faith with an immense amount of integrity. And there's other periods in time where we see this. But I think that we look back into our history and we find these people like Paul and Peter, James, John, setting examples. These guys are, at worst, they're blundering about. Or not at worst. At best, they're blundering about. Yeah. At worst, they're like Paul, actively pursuing and trying to stop and kill this. Yeah. And then you see this shift in them. And that shift is like the foundation that we look towards, that we want for ourselves. And I think that we want to share with others. So I think that we don't look to the temple, we look back to the church. And that's kind of my thoughts on that.
And thank you for sharing that. It sort of reminds us the importance of immersing ourselves again in the Bible story, and the story that obviously begins right in the Old Testament, but sort of has Jesus at the apex. And as Anabaptists, again, we look to, the Sermon on the Mount as just being this programmatic change moment, when Jesus is just talking about a very, very different kingdom, and the early church as now, with the Spirit coming, just being the outworking of how that kingdom starts to take root after Jesus has left.
Yeah.
And so, great example there. And just reminds us, as I said, of that importance of just being able to, just read those stories well. And to read them in ways in which to see, what lessons and what wisdom can we lift from that. So I agree with you. Certainly do look to the early church, do look to Christ's example as well of that. And what you mentioned something else which was actually interesting in that, and that is that early church, that vision is lived out still in the reality of the world in which we live.
Yeah.
And one of the pictures that for me just recently has really started to hit home is that biblical picture Jesus often uses, and that language of, birth pains. And it's a sense that, we live life in this world and the kingdom comes in, but we don't have that utopian view that it's just all going to be right. No, it's like birth pains. You have these convulsive moments, and there's this movement forward, but it does come.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great picture of hope for us.
Yeah.
So
just to add one thing.
Go for it.
A fun fact that I didn't put in the sermon.
You can give it here.
Fun fact.
Yeah, you can give it here.
So temples in the ancient world, what you put at the center of the temple is an idol.
An image and idol, yeah.
And that's kind of the gravity of your morality and everything revolves around this idol. In Christianity, the idol is people built in the image of God, and at the center of the temple is people. And that's why we put people first. And that's why Jesus, when he's talking with the Pharisees and the lawyers and all these people, and he keeps saying, people first.
People matter.
People matter.
Yeah.
That the law is meant to serve people because you are at the center of God's temple here.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is just amazing realization that Christianity really puts so much emphasis on caring for people, and that's why it should always stand in contrast to toxic cultures that are devouring people.
And just interesting again, just building off that, I was listening to a radio broadcast today, and nothing to do with faith or whatever, but they were just talking about the importance of, respecting human life and the value of human life, and I think if we can talk about, how we're living in a postmodern or post-Christian culture, but I think there are some remnants in the culture today that are really, really strong and we can affirm. Yeah. And that was one of those when the person was saying, but hang on, you've got to respect the dignity of this person.
Yeah.
And Christianity just reminds us that, God has invested us with this great dignity as his image bearers.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
And I think too that maybe to like dig a little bit at our culture, people's human dignity, I don't think is self-evident. We take it as self-evident.
self-evident.
We say, okay, this is self-evident. We're not going to look underneath this. We're not going to try and pull this apart. But I think with Christianity, it is self-evident because of how things have been structured by God. So, not to like push over modern culture or anything, but to say there's a line up here, but I think we have a deeper justification.
Yeah, and I wasn't trying to give the impression at all that, this is all across culture. No. We have so many movements around the world today where humanity is not respected.
Yeah.
And there's a total devaluing of humanity, the human person, and even just of collectively, of human society. So there are competing narratives out there, but that part of the narrative is, I think, certainly one that we can affirm.
Yeah.
So God takes justice seriously.
Yeah.
How we treat people seriously. And one of the things you pick up, or I certainly pick up as I read the stories of Jesus, when he's pretty cutting in his comments and he doesn't mince his words, it's often to do with how they treat people. So the passage presents us with a somewhat uncomfortable picture of Jesus as a judge.
Yeah.
And his words, as I said, are pretty harsh. So is this still an important motif for Christians and believers to hold on today, or is that language of judgment language that we as the church should move away from? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is really important language, and I think that the word that comes to my mind most readily when I see these passages, accountability. In Christianity, God takes us very seriously. What we say and do, he hears it and he follows up with it. And Psalm 73, the appearance of wickedness and this kind of power over culture seems to get everything it wants. But there's a reckoning that comes. And I think that for me, it makes so much sense to say that, if you're treating people badly, you're going to get your comeuppance. Yeah. What is maybe sometimes a little bit too personal or hits too close to home is when Jesus says that you're praying in front of people to get honor and praise. That is connected to this. You'll be punished the worst, right? Like you're getting the biggest bowl of comeuppance here. And, and it's like, I fall into that trap so easily. It's like, I want people to hear me and to be flabbergasted with what I've said.
We all like our egos fed every now and
again. Yeah.
We pretend that we don't.
Jesus like, no.
Yeah, none of that.
Yeah, I think that's part of what the tendency is with when Jesus is talking about judgment, is it's very much connected with you, the reader, hearing this and internalizing it and asking yourself, am I following the path of the Pharisees or the lawyers or whatever it may be that Jesus is taking down a notch? And that, every single time I go, I'm guilty, somewhat, and sometimes more so, but that feeling of I fall into that, and that causes me to pray for mercy and forgiveness, and then I think ideally to go to those people that maybe sometimes you're stepping over and admit what you've done. And
just talking about the Pharisees, it just reminds me of that picture that Jesus presents of the two people entering into the temple. There's the Pharisee coming in, and not that one wants to sort of make the standard caricature of the Pharisees as always being hypocritical. But the Pharisee comes in and is really proud and feeling good about what they've done, and you got the other person sort of walking who just describes as a sinner, and the person just really admits to God, I've done wrong, I've fallen short. And for me, that motif of Jesus as a judge, I think is also an important one to bear in mind for the point that you made that, with God there is a reckoning and there is an accounting. you know, and what the judgment's going to look like and what the judgment will take, you know. I think there are various views on that, and nobody can be absolutely certain. We do know that God is a God of mercy, but I think if we run to the mercy without realizing that, you know, the wrong actions that we do will be judged. There will be a reckoning and there will be an accounting. And if one thinks about if I could use the word, maybe even the fierceness of Jesus' attacks, it's not going to be a pleasant accounting. And that's really meant there as a warning to us, you know, a warning saying, don't do that. But I think to the point that you were making earlier, a reminder that God's given us this gift of agency, but He's also given us the gift of wisdom through His Word and the presence of the Spirit. So God takes what we do very, very seriously, you know, and that's something that we should bear in mind. We never ever want grace to be cheap and easy.
Yeah.
You know, so grace itself, even though it's free to us, is still costly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Nick, thank you. Really enjoyed that. Hopefully a very good and healthy and interesting discussion, and many, many interesting points for you to pick up on. And I know we often end off by giving you an opportunity to contribute. So if you have an example either of a toxic culture or of a toxic culture that changed that you'd like to share with us, feel free to do so. And see you next time.
Yeah. Bye.